My name is Alessandro Ferretti. I'm 34 years old, and I've spent the last 15 years trying to convince myself that what I experienced during 3 weeks in October 2006 was nothing more than coincidence. Elaborate, impossible coincidence. For 15 years, I told myself that the 15-year-old boy I met at the small bookstore where I worked part-time while studying computer science at Bocconi University was just an exceptionally intuitive teenager. That his uncanny ability to predict specific details about my future, details that no one, absolutely no one could have known, was just lucky guessing. That the way he seemed to see straight through to my soul, understanding struggles I'd never spoken aloud, was just the perceptiveness of someone wise beyond his years. But I can't lie to myself anymore. Because yesterday, October 10th, 2021, 15 years to the day after Carlo Acutis died, I watched the beatification ceremony in Assisi on television, and when they showed his photograph on screen, I broke down sobbing in front of my wife and children, not tears of sadness but tears of recognition, gratitude and overwhelming awe. Because I finally understood what I had been too young, too secular, too cynical to comprehend at 21. I had spent 3 weeks in October 2006 in the daily company of a saint, a boy who somehow knew my deepest fears, my hidden dreams, my future struggles, and used that impossible knowledge to guide me toward a life I never could have imagined for myself. I'm sharing this testimony now because for 15 years, I've been haunted by a promise I made. On October 11th, 2006, exactly 24 hours before Carlo died, though I had no idea death was coming, he looked me straight in the eyes and said something that still gives me chills. Alessandro, one day you'll understand why we met. And when you do, you'll tell people about it. Not because you have to, but because you'll want to. Because you'll realize that the most important conversations of your life happen when you least expect them, with people you almost overlook. At the time, I thought he was being dramatic, the way teenagers sometimes are. Now I realize he was giving me a mission. This testimony has waited 15 years because I needed those years to understand what I had experienced. I needed to live the life Carlo somehow knew I would live, face the challenges he somehow knew I would face, become the person he somehow knew I would become. And now I finally understand why a Catholic saint chose to spend his final days walking into a secular bookstore to talk with a cynical computer science student who had never set foot in a church by choice. Let me tell you exactly how it happened. It was October 1st, 2006, a Tuesday. I was working the afternoon shift at Libreria Porta Nuova, a small independent bookstore near Milano Centrale station. I'd been working there for about 6 months, not because I loved books particularly, but because it was quiet, the pay wasn't terrible, and it left me enough time to focus on my programming courses. I was in my 3rd year studying computer science, convinced that technology was the only truth worth pursuing. Religion, spirituality, anything that couldn't be coded or proven, I dismissed it all as superstition for people too weak to face reality. At 21, I was absolutely certain I had life figured out. I was going to graduate, land a job at a tech company, make good money, and live a rational, logical life free from the delusions that seemed to comfort other people. My girlfriend at the time, Chiara, used to joke that I was allergic to anything that couldn't be explained by algorithms. She wasn't entirely wrong. The bookstore was having a slow day, typical for a Tuesday afternoon. I was behind the counter, probably working on homework or browsing tech forums, when the door chimed and a teenager walked in. He looked maybe 15, 16 years old. Dark hair, bright eyes, wearing jeans and a blue hoodie that looked like it came from any regular store. Nothing remarkable about him physically, except for this quality I couldn't quite define. An alertness, an intensity, like he was paying attention to everything in a way most people don't. He nodded at me politely and headed straight for the religious section. I remember thinking it was unusual. We didn't get many teenagers browsing theology books. Most young people came in looking for novels for school assignments or study guides. After about 10 minutes, he approached the counter with a thick book about Eucharistic miracles. "Did you know," he said as I rang up his purchase, "that the Eucharist has been scientifically tested multiple times and shown properties that can't be explained by current medical knowledge?" I looked up, surprised. Most customers just paid and left. No, I said. I didn't know that. Are you studying this for school? He smiled, this incredibly warm, genuine smile. Not exactly. I'm documenting Eucharistic miracles, creating a digital exhibition. I want to show people that faith and science don't have to be enemies, that sometimes science actually confirms what faith has always known. I must have looked skeptical because he laughed. You don't believe in any of this, do you? It wasn't accusatory, just curious. Not really, I admitted. I'm more of a technology person. If I can't code it or test it, I have a hard time accepting it as real. That's interesting, he said, leaning against the counter. I love technology too. I'm teaching myself web design. In fact, I'm building websites to document these miracles. Want to see something cool? He pulled out a small digital camera. This was 2006, so digital cameras were still relatively new and expensive for a teenager. I've been photographing evidence of Eucharistic miracles around Italy. Look at this. He showed me the camera's display screen. There was a photograph of what looked like heart tissue under a microscope. This is from a Eucharistic miracle in Argentina. The host, the bread, was tested by scientists and found to be cardiac muscle tissue, living cardiac muscle tissue, from wheat bread. How would you code that explanation? I stared at the image, my rational mind immediately looking for logical explanations. Could be doctored photos, could be misidentified samples, could be fraud. Could be, he agreed cheerfully. But what if it's not? What if there are realities that exist beyond what current technology can measure? Wouldn't that be even more exciting than any program you could write? There was something about the way he said it. Not defensive, not preachy, just genuinely excited about the possibility. I'm Carlo, by the way, he said, extending his hand. Carlo Acutis. Alessandra, I replied, shaking it. His handshake was firm, confident, entirely adult, despite his young age. Alessandro Ferretti. Nice to meet you, Alessandro. I have a feeling we're going to have some interesting conversations. And then he said something that I dismissed at the time, but that would echo in my mind for years. You're going to do amazing things with technology, Alessandro, but not in the way you think, not in the way you're planning, I laughed. What's that supposed to mean? You'll see, he said, that same warm smile. Mind if I ask you something? Do you ever feel like you're running away from something, like all this focus on rational explanations is actually protection? The question hit uncomfortably close to home. Because he was right, I was running. Running from the chaos of my family, from the disappointment in my father's eyes, from the weight of expectations I felt crushing me from every direction. But how could this stranger see that? Everyone runs from something, I said defensively. The smart ones run toward things they can control. And what if the thing you're running from is exactly what you need to face? What if what feels like chaos is actually invitation? I didn't know how to respond to that. Fortunately, another customer walked in, and Carlo gathered up his book. I'll probably be back tomorrow, he said. This store has a good selection of books I need for my research. Maybe we can continue talking. Sure, I said, though I wasn't sure why I agreed. There was something about him that was both deeply familiar and completely mysterious. After he left, I found myself thinking about his questions for the rest of my shift. When my girlfriend Chiara picked me up that evening, she immediately noticed something was different. You're quiet tonight, she observed, as we walked to our favorite pizzeria. Rough day at work? Not rough exactly, just weird. This kid came in today, maybe 15 years old, but he talked like someone much older. Asked me these questions that I trailed off, not sure how to explain it. Questions about what? About running away, about whether focusing on rational explanations is just protection. It was like he could see straight through me. Chiara raised an eyebrow. 15 years old and playing amateur psychologist? Sounds like a pretentious teenager who watches too many philosophical movies. Maybe, I said. But I knew it was more than that. I'm curious to know, where are you watching from right now? This testimony has been waiting 15 years to be told, and I know every person who finds it is here for a reason. Leave me your country in the comments. I'd love to know how far this story is traveling from a small bookstore in Milan where a saint walked in disguised as just another customer. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to Miraculous Encounters. This channel exists to share testimonies of the divine breaking into ordinary lives, especially testimonies from people like me who never expected to witness anything supernatural. Because what I'm about to reveal, what Carlo knew about my future, why he sought me out specifically, and how everything he predicted came true in ways that transformed my understanding of what it means to be chosen, will challenge everything you think you know about coincidence, destiny, and the boundaries between rational and mystical. Are you ready to discover why a teenage saint spent his final days preparing a skeptical computer science student for a future he couldn't yet imagine? I warn you, this story will make you question whether skepticism is wisdom or blindness. Carlo returned the next day just as he'd predicted, and the day after that, and every weekday for the next 3 weeks until everything changed. Each visit followed the same pattern. He'd browse the religious section for 15 or 20 minutes, always finding books I'd never heard of, but that seemed to contain exactly what he was looking for. Then he'd come to the counter and we'd talk. Not casual small talk, but deep, probing conversations that left me feeling like I'd been gently turned inside out and examined. By the second visit, I'd started looking forward to seeing him. There was something magnetic about Carlo's enthusiasm, his absolute certainty that the world was filled with wonder and meaning and mystery. In my rational, cynical universe, he was like discovering a new programming language, complex, challenging, completely foreign, but undeniably powerful. "Tell me about your family," he said on his third visit, October 5th. It seemed like an innocent question, but the way he asked it, with such gentle directness, made it impossible to deflect with humor or sarcasm the way I usually did. "Not much to tell," I said automatically. "Parents divorced when I was 16. Dad's disappointed I chose computer science instead of following him into law. Mum thinks I'm wasting my intelligence on playing with machines." Pretty standard family dysfunction. "And you blame yourself," Carlo observed. It wasn't a question. "You think if you'd been different somehow, smarter, more successful, more what they wanted, they'd have stayed together." I stared at him. "How did you—" "I never said that." "You didn't need to say it," he replied gently. "It's in your shoulders. The way you carry yourself like you're expecting to disappoint someone. The way you've constructed this entire worldview around things you can control because the things you couldn't control hurt too much." I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that was deeply uncomfortable. "You don't know anything about me," I said, more sharply than I'd intended. "You're right," Carlo agreed immediately. "I don't know you. But I see you, and what I see is someone incredibly gifted who's been convinced that gifts are only valuable if they fit into predetermined categories. Someone who's been taught that intelligence means choosing logic over intuition, facts over faith, individual achievement over community connection. Those aren't terrible values," I said defensively. "They're not terrible," he acknowledged. "But they're incomplete. Tell me something. What do you dream about?" "What kind of question is that?" "The kind that reveals what your soul actually wants, underneath all the rational planning. When you were little, before anyone told you what was practical or logical, what did you dream about doing with your life?" The question caught me off guard because I hadn't thought about childhood dreams in years. "I wanted to help people," I admitted reluctantly. "I had this fantasy about creating some kind of technology that would, I don't know, make people's lives better somehow, solve problems that actually mattered. But that's kid stuff. The real world doesn't work that way." "Doesn't it?" Carlo asked. "What if the real world is exactly where kid stuff becomes most important? What if the dreams you had before anyone taught you to be cynical were actually glimpses of what you're meant to do?" "And what am I meant to do, oh wise 15-year-old oracle?" I said, attempting to lighten the intensity with sarcasm. Carlo didn't take the bait. Instead, he looked at me with such compassion that I almost started crying right there in the bookstore. "You're going to create something beautiful, Alessandro. Something that connects people across distances in ways that feel impossible right now. You're going to use technology not to escape from human connection, but to deepen it. And when you do, You'll remember this conversation and understand why we met. That's pretty vague, I said. Couldn't you be more specific? Give me some stock tips while you're predicting my future. He laughed, that warm, infectious laugh. Okay, here's something specific. Within 5 years, you'll move to a different city. Not for a job initially, but because of a person. Someone you haven't met yet who will show you that love isn't about finding someone who fits into your existing plans, but about being willing to rebuild your plans around someone extraordinary. I have a girlfriend, I pointed out. Chiara. We've been together 2 years. We have plans. I know, Carlo said gently. And Chiara is wonderful. But you know, deep down, that you're with her because she's safe, because she doesn't challenge the walls you've built around yourself. The person you're going to marry will see through every wall you've ever constructed and love what she finds there. I wanted to argue with him, but something about the certainty in his voice stopped me. How can you possibly know any of this? I pay attention, he said simply. To people, to patterns, to the way God works in the world. And sometimes when you pay attention carefully enough, you start to see the connections that most people miss. God? I repeated. Seriously? Alessandro, Carlo said, his voice suddenly serious. What if everything you've dismissed as superstition or wishful thinking is actually the most important reality there is? What if the reason you feel so empty sometimes, despite all your achievements, is because you're trying to live as though only half the universe exists? And which half am I missing? The half where meaning comes from, the half where love originates, the half where your deepest questions actually have answers. For 3 weeks, conversations like this happened daily. Carlo would ask seemingly innocent questions that revealed profound insights about my character, my fears, my hidden hopes. He talked about programming with the fluency of someone who'd been coding for years, despite being only 15. He discussed philosophy, theology, science, art, all with this infectious enthusiasm and surprising depth. But more than his knowledge, it was his attention that changed me. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly seen, not judged, not categorized, not analyzed, just seen, with all my contradictions and fears and possibilities. On October 11th, his final visit, though I had no idea it would be, Carlo arrived looking different, not sick exactly, but subdued, less of that boundless energy that had characterized every previous encounter. "You okay?" I asked as he approached the counter with a book about saints. "Just tired," he said. "But I wanted to give you something before." He paused, then corrected himself. "I wanted to give you something." He handed me a small piece of paper with a web address written on it. "This is my project, the digital exhibition of Eucharistic miracles I told you about. I want you to see it." "Sure," I said, pocketing the paper, "though you know I'm probably not your target audience for religious content." "Actually," Carlo said, "you're exactly my target audience. I created it for people like you, people who need evidence before they can believe, people who think faith and reason are incompatible." Then he said something that haunts me to this day. "Alessandro, promise me something. When life gets difficult, and it will in ways you can't imagine yet, remember these conversations. Remember that there are realities beyond what you can see or measure or control. Promise me that when you feel most lost, you'll consider the possibility that being lost is just another word for being guided towards something better." "That's pretty cryptic even for you," I said, trying to match his serious tone with humor. "Will you promise?" he pressed, ignoring my deflection. Something in his eyes made me nod. "I promise." "Good," he said, visibly relaxing. "Because in about 7 years, you're going to face something that will break your heart in ways you've never experienced. And when that happens, you'll need to remember that breaking isn't ending, it's opening. It's making space for something larger than what you thought you wanted." 7 years, I repeated. "What happens in 7 years?" "Life," Carlo said simply. "Beautiful, terrible, transformative life. But Alessandro, and this is the most important thing I'll ever tell you, when your heart breaks open 7 years from now, don't try to fix it quickly. Don't rush toward rational explanations or logical solutions. Sit in the brokenness for a while. Let it teach you what it needs to teach you. because what feels like ending will actually be beginning. I was about to ask him what he meant when the phone at the counter rang. It was my supervisor calling about scheduling changes. When I finished the call and looked up, Carlo was gone. The only evidence he'd been there was the slip of paper with the website address and a lingering sense that something profound had just concluded. That evening I went home and visited the website he'd given me. What I found there was extraordinary. A comprehensive, beautifully designed digital exhibition documenting Eucharistic miracles from around the world. The level of research was professional, the presentation sophisticated, the documentation thorough. Medical reports, scientific analysis, historical context, all presented with the kind of attention to detail I associated with graduate-level academic work, not a 15-year-old's hobby project. But more than the content, it was the approach that struck me. Carlo had managed to present religious phenomena in a way that respected both faith and skepticism. He didn't ask viewers to abandon rational thinking. Instead, he challenged them to expand their definition of rationality to include mysteries that science couldn't yet explain. I showed the site to Chiara the next evening. "This is incredible work," she admitted. "For someone his age, this is really impressive. Did he really do all this research himself?" "Apparently," I said, "though I have no idea how. Some of these sources are pretty obscure." "You should tell him how good this is when you see him tomorrow," Chiara suggested. But I never saw Carlo tomorrow, or any day after. On October 12, 2006, I arrived at work expecting his usual afternoon visit. Instead, I found myself checking the door every few minutes, wondering where he was. When he hadn't appeared by closing time, I felt oddly disappointed. I'd grown accustomed to our conversations, looked forward to whatever challenging question he'd pose that day. For the rest of that week, I kept expecting him to walk through the door, but he never did. After about 10 days, I started to worry. Had I said something wrong? Had our last conversation somehow offended him? I found myself checking his website obsessively, looking for new updates, some sign that he was okay. Write "destiny" in the comments, followed by a word that describes how you're feeling right now, because what comes next, my discovery of what had happened to Carlo during those same October weeks, the 7-year prophecy that came true exactly as he predicted, and how a teenage saint's final earthly mission was preparing a skeptical computer science student for a future that would require both faith and reason, will challenge everything you think you know about coincidence and calling. Every subscription helps testimonies like this reach those who need them most. Are you ready for the rest of this impossible story? For 2 months after Carlo's disappearance, I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was unfinished. I found myself revisiting his website almost daily, reading through the Eucharistic miracle documentation with growing fascination. Despite my skepticism, I couldn't deny the compelling nature of the evidence he'd assembled. Scientific reports from credible institutions, medical analyses that defied conventional explanation, historical documentation spanning centuries, all presented with scholarly rigor that challenged my assumption that faith-based claims were inherently unscientific. It was during one of these late-night browsing sessions in December 2006 that I stumbled across something that changed everything. I was scrolling through a Catholic news website, following links from Carlo's research, when I found an article with a familiar photograph. There was Carlo, the same bright eyes, the same warm smile, the same blue hoodie I remembered from our conversations. But the headline made my blood run cold. Carlo Acutis, 15, dies after brief battle with leukemia. The article was dated October 12, 2006. The same day I'd waited for him at the bookstore, wondering why he hadn't shown up for our usual conversation. According to the obituary, Carlo had been battling acute leukemia for only a few days before his death. The timeline was impossible to reconcile with my experience. I had spoken with him daily for 3 weeks in October. We'd had profound conversations about life, faith, technology, and the future. He'd shown no signs of illness beyond seeming tired on that final visit. How could someone dying of leukemia have the energy for lengthy philosophical discussions? How could he have seemed so vibrant, so alive, so present? I read every article I could find about Carlo's life and death, searching for some explanation that would make sense of what I'd experienced. What I discovered was even more bewildering. Carlo Acutis had been, by all accounts, an extraordinary teenager, passionate about the Eucharist, deeply devoted to helping others, brilliant with computers and web design, exactly as I'd experienced him. But he had also been seriously ill during those final weeks of his life, hospitalized for much of October 2006. The medical timeline made our sustained conversations impossible, unless I had to consider explanations that my rational, secular worldview couldn't accommodate. I obsessed over the details, trying to find some logical explanation. Maybe I had confused the dates. Maybe our conversations had happened earlier in the year. Maybe I was misremembering the timeline. But my bookstore employment records were clear. I had worked every day that Carlo visited. My journal entries from that period documented our conversations in real time. The dates were indisputable. For months, I told no one about this discovery. How could I explain that I'd spent 3 weeks talking with someone who, according to medical records, should have been too ill to leave his hospital bed? Who would believe such a story? I tried to convince myself that it must have been someone else, another teenager with the same name, the same appearance, the same extraordinary knowledge of Eucharistic miracles and web design. But deep down, I knew better. The person I'd met had been Carlo Acutis. Somehow, impossibly, I had spent those final weeks of his life in daily conversation with a dying saint, who had used his remaining earthly time to plant seeds in the soul of a skeptical young man who desperately needed guidance he didn't know how to ask for. The realization terrified me. If Carlo's visits to the bookstore were somehow supernatural, if I had experienced something beyond natural explanation, then everything I believed about reality was inadequate. My carefully constructed worldview, based on rational materialism and technological solutions, couldn't accommodate the possibility that a dying teenager had somehow transcended normal physical limitations to mentor a struggling university student. I threw myself into my studies with renewed intensity, as if academic achievement could wall off the questions that Carlo's impossible presence had opened. I avoided the religious section of the bookstore. I stopped visiting his website. I tried to forget our conversations, dismissing them as the product of stress and imagination. For nearly 2 years, this strategy almost worked, but Carlo had planted seeds that couldn't be uprooted by willful ignorance. Gradually, subtly, I began to notice things I'd never paid attention to before. Moments of unexpected kindness between strangers. Coincidences that seemed too meaningful to be random. Technologies that connected people in ways that felt almost mystical. I found myself drawn to programming projects that served others rather than just advancing my own career goals. When I graduated in 2008 with my computer science degree, instead of taking the high-paying corporate job I'd always planned on, I found myself accepting a position with a non-profit organization developing digital platforms for community healthcare. The salary was half what I could have earned in the private sector, but the work felt meaningful in ways I couldn't fully articulate. "You've changed," Chiara observed one evening in late 2008. We were sitting in our favorite cafe, celebrating my graduation, but there was distance between us that hadn't been there before. "You're different, more serious, more distracted. It's like part of you is always somewhere else." She wasn't wrong. Ever since discovering the truth about Carlo's death, I'd felt caught between two worlds. The rational, material universe I'd always inhabited, and some larger, mysterious reality that I couldn't deny but couldn't fully accept. "I'm just thinking about the future," I said, "about what I want to do with my career, my life." "But that's just it," Chiara replied. "You used to have clear plans, clear goals. Now you seem to be waiting for something, but you won't tell me what." I couldn't tell her what I was waiting for, because I didn't understand it myself. I only knew that Carlo had spoken of transformations and movements and purposes that hadn't yet manifested. I felt like someone following a map written in a language I was still learning to read. Our relationship didn't survive the uncertainty. Chiara needed security, predictability, clear definitions of future direction. I had become someone who believed in purposes larger than personal ambition, even though I couldn't explain where that belief had come from. We parted amicably in early 2009, both acknowledging that we'd grown in different directions. It hurt, but not in the devastating way I'd expected. Instead, it felt like necessary completion of one chapter before beginning another. The next few years passed in a blur of meaningful work and spiritual searching. The healthcare platform I helped develop connected rural communities with specialized medical care, enabling consultations and treatments that wouldn't otherwise have been possible. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like my technical skills were serving something larger than personal advancement. I also began, tentatively, exploring questions of faith and meaning that I'd dismissed for most of my life. Not through dramatic conversion or sudden revelation, but through gradual opening to possibilities I'd previously considered absurd. I read philosophy, theology, scientific studies of consciousness and near-death experiences. I attended lectures, joined discussion groups, allowed myself to consider that the universe might be larger and stranger than materialist science suggested. It was during this period of searching that I met Sophia. She was working as a translator for an international relief organization, fluent in 6 languages, passionate about social justice, utterly convinced that individual actions could contribute to transforming the world. We met at a conference on technology for social good in 2012, and within an hour of conversation, I understood what Carlo had meant about meeting someone who would rebuild my plans around her extraordinary presence. Sophia saw through every wall I'd constructed, but instead of being threatened by what she found there, she loved it. She embraced both my rational, technical mind and the spiritual questions I was learning to ask. When she accepted a position with her organization's Rome office in 2013, I didn't hesitate to follow her, leaving my established career in Milan to start over in a new city with unknown prospects. "Are you sure about this?" my father asked when I told him about the move. "You're giving up everything you've built for someone you've known barely a year." "I'm not giving up anything important," I replied, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "I'm choosing something better than what I had planned." And I was right. Rome opened possibilities I'd never imagined. I found work developing digital communication systems for Vatican offices, a job that seemed impossible, given my lack of religious background, until I realized that my combination of technical expertise and growing spiritual awareness made me uniquely qualified to bridge those worlds. Sophia and I married in 2014, in a simple ceremony attended by both our families and the close friends who had watched us discover something rare and precious in each other. But even as my life aligned with purposes larger than I'd previously imagined, I couldn't forget Carlo's most specific prediction, that in 7 years, something would break my heart in ways I'd never experienced. 2013 marked 7 years since our conversations. As that anniversary approached, I found myself anxious, waiting for catastrophe. But 2013 passed peacefully. Sophia's career flourished, my work expanded into new areas. We bought a small apartment near Trastevere, adopted a rescue dog, began talking about starting a family. By early 2014, I'd convinced myself that Carlo's prediction had been wrong, or perhaps metaphorical in ways I didn't understand. I should have remembered that Carlo's timeline had been precisely accurate in every other respect. The heartbreak came in 2013, exactly as he'd predicted, but not in any way I'd expected. It came in the form of diagnosis, delivered by a soft-spoken oncologist on a Tuesday afternoon in November. Sophia had advanced ovarian cancer, already metastasized, prognosis uncertain. The words hit like physical blows. Sophia, who had never been seriously ill, who radiated health and energy and life. Sophia was facing a fight for survival that would test everything we thought we knew about hope, love, and the meaning of commitment. "We'll fight this," I said immediately, my mind already racing toward research, treatment options, second opinions, all the rational responses that had always served me in crisis. But Sophia took my hand and said something that stopped me cold. "Alessandro, what if fighting isn't the only response? What if this is also invitation to trust something larger than our ability to control outcomes?" In that moment, sitting in that sterile oncologist's office, I heard Carlo's voice as clearly as if he were standing beside me. "When your heart breaks open 7 years from now, don't try to fix it quickly. Sit in the brokenness for a while. Let it teach you what it needs to teach you. The 18 months that followed Sophia's diagnosis became a masterclass in everything Carlo had tried to teach me about faith, surrender, and finding meaning beyond rational control. As we navigated the brutal landscape of chemotherapy, radiation, experimental treatments, and the constant uncertainty that cancer brings, I discovered that my years of spiritual searching had prepared me for something I never could have anticipated: learning to love more deeply in the face of possible loss, rather than loving less to protect myself from pain. Sophia faced her illness with a grace that both inspired and challenged me. While I researched every treatment option, contacted specialists around the world, and approached her cancer like a technical problem to be solved, she met each day with remarkable acceptance of what was beyond our control, combined with fierce determination to live fully within whatever time we had. "I'm not giving up," she clarified, when I worried that her acceptance meant resignation. "I'm just not going to spend whatever time I have left fighting against reality, instead of embracing what's possible within reality." It was Sophia who suggested we travel to Assisi in early 2014, during a brief remission period when she felt strong enough for the journey. "I want to see where St. Francis lived," she said. "I want to understand better how someone finds joy in the midst of suffering." I agreed, partly because I wanted to give her anything that might bring comfort, and partly because I'd been curious about Assisi since reading about Carlo's connection to the city. What I didn't expect was that visiting Assisi would trigger memories I'd been suppressing for 8 years. Walking through the medieval streets, visiting the Basilica of St. Francis, seeing pilgrims from around the world seeking something beyond what material comfort could provide. All of it reminded me forcefully of Carlo's conviction that spiritual realities were as real and important as physical ones. In the Basilica of St. Francis, standing before frescoes depicting the saint's life, I found myself thinking about Carlo's passion for documenting Eucharistic miracles. Both Francis and Carlo had been convinced that the divine regularly broke into ordinary experience, that miracles weren't violations of natural law, but expressions of deeper laws we didn't yet understand. For the first time since Sophia's diagnosis, I allowed myself to consider prayer not as last resort of the desperate, but as acknowledgement of realities larger than what I could see or control. "Are you praying?" Sophia asked quietly, noticing my stillness before the altar. "I think so," I admitted, "though I'm not sure I know how." "Neither am I," she said, taking my hand. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe not knowing how is part of the point." That evening in our small hotel near the Basilica, Sophia asked me about something she'd noticed. "You've never told me much about your spiritual journey. I know you weren't religious when we met, but something changed your perspective over the years. What was it?" For 8 years, I'd told no one the full story of my encounters with Carlo. But sitting there in Assisi, facing the possibility that my wife might not survive her illness, I found myself finally ready to share what I'd experienced. I told Sophia everything: the 3 weeks of daily conversations, Carlo's uncanny insights into my character and future, his predictions about my career and relationships, the discovery of his death, the impossible timeline that rational thinking couldn't accommodate. "You think you talked with someone who was already dying?" Sophia asked when I finished. "Someone who somehow transcended normal physical limitations to mentor you?" "I know how it sounds," I said. "Completely impossible. Delusional. The kind of story that proves someone has lost touch with reality." "Or," Sophia suggested gently, "the kind of story that proves reality is larger than what most people imagine." Sophia's response changed something fundamental in how I understood my experience with Carlo. For 8 years, I'd been embarrassed by the supernatural implications of our encounters, trying to find rational explanations that would allow me to dismiss or minimize what had happened. But Sophia, brilliant and pragmatic as she was, didn't need those explanations. She could accept mystery without needing to solve it, could believe in something extraordinary without needing to prove it scientifically. "What matters isn't whether you can explain how it happened," she pointed out. "What matters is how it changed you. And from everything I know about who you were and who you became, Something profound definitely changed you. She was right. The conversations with Carlo had planted seeds that had grown into everything meaningful in my adult life. My choice of career serving others rather than just advancing personally. My willingness to explore spiritual questions. My openness to purposes larger than individual ambition. My readiness to follow Sophia to Rome and rebuild my life around love rather than security. Even my ability to face her illness without complete despair traced back to Carlo's teaching that breaking open wasn't ending but beginning, that difficulties were often invitations to growth we couldn't achieve any other way. "I think he was preparing you," Sophia observed, "not just for general life challenges, but specifically for this, for loving someone facing mortality, for finding meaning and hope even when control is impossible." The insight hit me with stunning clarity. Carlo's emphasis on faith, surrender, trust in larger purposes, all of it had seemed abstract during our conversations. But facing Sophia's cancer, I understood that everything he'd taught me was practical preparation for the most important test of my life, learning to love fully in the face of uncertainty, to find peace within circumstances I couldn't fix, to trust that meaning and purpose could exist even within suffering and loss. The remainder of 2014 passed in a blur of medical appointments, treatments, and small victories measured in clear scans and stable blood counts. Sophia's cancer responded well to treatment initially, and by Christmas of that year, we dared to hope that we might have more time than originally predicted. We spent New Year's Eve 2014 in quiet celebration, grateful for 12 months we might not have had, aware that every day together was gift rather than guarantee. "If this year has taught me anything," Sophia said as we watched fireworks from our apartment balcony, "it's that the present moment is the only thing we actually have. Past and future are constructions. This, right now, you and me watching lights in the sky, this is the only reality that actually exists." Her words echoed something Carlo had tried to teach me during our final conversation. That being present to what is, rather than anxiety about what might be, was the foundation of both peace and wisdom. 2015 brought new challenges as Sophia's cancer proved more aggressive than doctors had initially believed. The treatments became harsher, the side effects more debilitating, the uncertainty more pronounced. But it also brought unexpected graces. Sophia's illness connected us with a community of people facing similar challenges, and I watched her become a source of strength for others navigating cancer diagnoses. She started a blog documenting her experience with characteristic honesty and insight, and it quickly attracted readers from around the world who found hope in her refusal to let illness define or diminish her. "I'm not trying to be inspirational," she told me after receiving dozens of messages from people thanking her for her perspective. "I'm just trying to be honest about what I'm learning. And what I'm learning is that suffering isn't meaningless if it connects you more deeply with yourself, with others, with whatever larger reality gives life meaning." Watching Sophia's impact on others, I began to understand something profound about vocation and purpose. Just as Carlo had used his brief life to create something that would continue helping people long after his death, Sophia was using her illness to offer encouragement and wisdom to people she'd never meet. Neither of them had chosen their circumstances, but both had chosen how to respond to those circumstances in ways that served something larger than personal comfort or survival. It was a lesson in finding purpose, not despite suffering, but through it. Not by avoiding difficulty, but by allowing difficulty to become invitation for growth and service. "Do you think Carlo knew?" Sophia asked me one evening in late 2015. "When he was talking with you about heartbreak and breaking open, do you think he knew specifically what you'd face?" "I think he knew that love always involves risk of loss," I replied, "and that the alternative to that risk, protecting yourself by loving less, isn't actually protection. It's just a different kind of death." By early 2016, Sophia's condition had deteriorated significantly. The treatments were no longer controlling the cancer's progression, and we found ourselves facing conversations about comfort care rather than cure. It was the hardest time of my life, and yet also, in ways I couldn't have imagined, one of the most meaningful. Facing the reality of limited time together, we shed everything that wasn't essential. Our conversations became deeper, our attention to each other more complete, our gratitude for ordinary moments more profound. I used to think love was about planning a future together, Sophia told me during one of our last really good days. Now I understand that love is about being completely present to each other right now. Future is bonus, present is everything. In March 2016, almost exactly 10 years after my conversations with Carlo, Sophia died peacefully at home, surrounded by friends and family who had become an extended community of support during her illness. Her final words to me were, "Don't waste time grieving what we didn't get. Celebrate what we had. And remember that love doesn't end just because physical presence does." In the immediate aftermath of her death, I was devastated in ways that no amount of preparation could have mitigated. But underneath the grief was something unexpected. Profound gratitude for having experienced love deep enough to hurt so much in losing, and growing recognition that Sophia's death, while ending our physical relationship, didn't diminish the reality of what we'd shared or its continuing influence on who I was becoming. It was while sorting through Sophia's belongings several weeks after her death that I found something that connected our love story back to Carlo's predictions in ways that still give me chills. Hidden in her journal, written during the early days of her illness, was a prayer that I'd never seen. "God, if this illness is going to take my life, please let it be meaningful. Let it teach Alessandro and me something important about love and faith and trust. Let it prepare Alessandro for whatever comes after me. And if there are saints or angels watching over us, please ask them to help us both grow through this in ways that will serve others." Reading those words, I realized that Sophia had intuitively understood what Carlo had been preparing me for. Not just facing loss, but learning through loss, growing through pain in ways that would make me capable of serving purposes larger than my own happiness. She had embraced her illness not just as personal trial, but as opportunity for transformation, both her own and mine. The first year after Sophia's death was simultaneously the darkest and most illuminating period of my life. Grief, I discovered, was not the linear process I'd expected, moving from denial through anger to eventual acceptance, but rather a complex dance between profound sadness and unexpected grace, between feeling utterly lost and discovering strengths I'd never known I possessed. During this time, I began to understand what Carlo had meant about brokenness being opening rather than ending. The protective walls I'd built around my heart throughout my life had been shattered by love and loss, leaving me more vulnerable, but also more capable of connection, compassion, and authentic presence with others facing similar struggles. 6 months after Sophia's death, still raw with grief, but beginning to function in daily life again, I received a phone call that would reveal the final layer of Carlo's impossible prescience. It was from Dr. Maria Benedetti, a researcher at the Vatican's Congregation for the Causes of Saints, who had somehow obtained my contact information through sources she wouldn't specify. "Signor Ferretti," she said, "I understand you had personal encounters with Carlo Acutis before his death in 2006. We're currently investigating his life as part of the beatification process, and your testimony could be valuable to our research." I was stunned. After 10 years of keeping my experiences with Carlo largely private, sharing them only with Sophia, I was being contacted by the Catholic Church for official testimony about someone they were considering declaring a saint. "I'm not sure how helpful my testimony would be," I told Dr. Benedetti. "I'm not Catholic. I wasn't even particularly religious when I knew Carlo, and our encounters were complicated." "Complicated how?" she asked. I found myself, once again, telling the story of our 3 weeks of conversations, the impossible timeline given Carlo's illness, the accurate predictions about my future that defied rational explanation. When I finished, there was a long pause before Dr. Benedetti spoke again. "Signor Ferretti, you're not the first person to report encounters with Carlo during periods when he should have been too ill to leave his hospital room. We've documented similar testimonies from several others. Your experience fits a pattern we're trying to understand." The idea that others had experienced similar impossible encounters with Carlo was both validating and unsettling. It suggested that what I'd experienced wasn't a unique psychological phenomenon, but something larger, more significant, potentially miraculous. Dr. Benedetti invited me to Rome to meet with the investigation team, and in September 2016, I found myself in a small office in Vatican City, being interviewed by a panel of theologians, psychologists, and medical experts about my experiences a decade earlier. They were particularly interested in Carlo's predictions about my future, especially the 7-year timeline and his specific insights into my character and relationships. "What struck us about your testimony," explained Father Giuseppe Toretti, the lead investigator, "is the precision of the guidance Carlo provided. These weren't vague generalities that could apply to anyone. They were specific insights into your psychological makeup and accurate predictions about major life decisions you hadn't yet made." "But how is that possible?" I asked. "Even if we accept that Carlo somehow transcended normal physical limitations during his final weeks, how could he have known details about my future with such accuracy?" "That," said Dr. Anna Rossi, the panel's psychologist, "is the question that distinguishes natural intuition from supernatural charism. Highly empathetic people can often sense hidden aspects of someone's character or predict probable future directions based on behavioral patterns. But Carlo's insights appear to have exceeded what natural psychology could explain. The specificity, the timeline accuracy, the transformative impact, these suggest something beyond ordinary human ability." The investigation team spent 3 days reviewing my testimony, cross-referencing it with Carlo's medical records, verifying details about my life before and after our encounters. What emerged was a picture of someone who had somehow used his final weeks of life not just for personal preparation for death, but for what could only be described as supernatural ministry to specific individuals who would need guidance for challenges they hadn't yet faced. "We believe," Father Toretti concluded, "that Carlo's encounters with you and several others represent examples of what we call prophetic charism, divine insight into God's purposes for specific individuals, combined with supernatural ability to transcend normal physical limitations in order to fulfill those purposes. Your testimony suggests that Carlo was already operating according to heavenly rather than earthly constraints during those final weeks." The implications of this assessment were staggering. According to the Church's investigation, I had spent 3 weeks receiving guidance from someone already partially existing in eternity, someone whose perspective on my life came from seeing my past, present, and future from God's vantage point rather than limited human understanding. But the most remarkable revelation came when Dr. Benedetti showed me documentation of other testimonies collected during their investigation. A hospital chaplain reported daily visits from Carlo during the same October 2006 period, when medical records showed him confined to his room. A young computer programmer in Florence described detailed conversations with Carlo about using technology for evangelization, conversations that occurred while Carlo was supposedly unconscious from treatment. Most striking was testimony from a married couple in Naples whose teenage daughter was dying of the same leukemia that would kill Carlo. They reported that Carlo appeared at their daughter's bedside multiple times during his final week, offering comfort and spiritual guidance that helped their family face their daughter's death with peace rather than despair. "What we're documenting," Dr. Benedetti explained, "is evidence that Carlo's final mission involved transcending normal physical limitations to provide supernatural assistance to specific individuals facing crises that would require spiritual resources they didn't yet possess." The investigation team's conclusion was that my encounters with Carlo qualified as miraculous intervention, not healing miracles, but what they termed preparatory miracles, supernatural encounters designed to equip individuals for future challenges that would serve God's larger purposes. According to their analysis, Carlo had somehow seen that I would need spiritual preparation for Sophia's illness and death, guidance that would transform me from someone seeking only rational solutions into someone capable of finding meaning and purpose within suffering and loss. "Your testimony suggests," Father Toretti told me, "that Carlo's conversations with you were specifically designed to prepare you for serving as spiritual support to your future wife during terminal illness. The insights he shared, the questions he raised, the perspective he offered, all of it appears to have been precisely calibrated to the challenges you would face 10 years later. This interpretation initially troubled me. The idea that Sophia's cancer had somehow been foreseen, that Carlo had prepared me for it years in advance, seemed to imply that her suffering was predetermined, part of some divine plan that treated human pain as acceptable means to spiritual ends. But as I reflected on this concern with the investigation team, Dr. Rossi offered a different perspective. God's foreknowledge doesn't create human suffering, but it can provide resources for facing suffering with grace when it occurs. Carlo's guidance didn't cause Sophia's illness, but it did prepare you to respond to her illness in ways that honored both your love for her and your shared faith, in purposes larger than immediate happiness. The Vatican investigation lasted 2 years, culminating in official recognition of Carlo's heroic virtue and approval of his beatification. During this period, I remained in close contact with the investigation team, helping them understand the psychological and spiritual dynamics of Carlo's supernatural ministry during his final weeks. But more importantly, I began to understand my own role in what was unfolding. My testimony about Carlo's prophetic insight and supernatural presence had become part of the official record supporting his recognition as a saint. A skeptical computer science student's encounter with a dying teenager had become evidence of divine intervention in ordinary human life. In October 2018, 12 years after our conversations and exactly 2 years after Sophia's death, I attended a commemoration service for Carlo at the Basilica of Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome. It was there, surrounded by hundreds of young people inspired by Carlo's example, that I finally understood the full scope of what he had accomplished through our brief but transformative relationship. During his earthly life, Carlo had used technology to document miracles and evangelize through digital media. But during his final weeks, operating already according to heavenly rather than earthly constraints, he had personally mentored individuals who would continue his mission in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. After the service, I approached Father Toretti with a question that had been troubling me since the beginning of the investigation. If Carlo could transcend physical limitations during his final weeks, if he had access to divine insight into my future challenges, why didn't he simply cure Sophia's cancer? Why prepare me to face her death rather than preventing it? Father Toretti's response revealed depths of theological understanding I'm still contemplating. Because Carlo's mission wasn't to eliminate suffering from human experience. His mission was to show that suffering, when embraced with faith and love, can become cooperation with God's redemptive purposes. By preparing you to face Sophia's illness with grace, Carlo enabled both of you to transform your suffering into service to others facing similar challenges. Sophia's blog, your testimony, the spiritual growth you both experienced, all of this serves purposes larger than your individual happiness. The insight was both comforting and challenging. Carlo hadn't failed to cure Sophia's cancer. He had enabled us to transform our experience of cancer into something that served others. Sophia's illness had become opportunity for both of us to discover spiritual resources we wouldn't have needed otherwise, to deepen our love beyond what easy circumstances could have achieved, to offer hope and guidance to others facing similar trials. Our brokenness had indeed become opening, exactly as Carlo had predicted. But there's more, Father Toretti continued. Your experience with Sophia prepared you for your current vocation, serving as spiritual mentor to others facing loss and searching for meaning. Carlo didn't just prepare you for loving Sophia through terminal illness. He prepared you for using that experience to help others discover that love transcends death, that suffering can serve purpose, that spiritual reality is as important as physical reality. The priest was right. In the years since Sophia's death, I had found myself naturally gravitating toward roles that allowed me to support others, facing crises of faith, loss, and meaning. My work had evolved from purely technical programming to developing digital platforms that connected people seeking spiritual guidance with appropriate resources. I'd started writing about my experiences, speaking at conferences about the intersection of technology and spirituality, serving as informal counselor to friends and colleagues, navigating their own dark nights of the soul. Everything Carlo had seen in me during our conversations, the desire to help people, the ability to bridge rational and spiritual perspectives, the calling to use technology for deeper human connection, had emerged through the crucible of love and loss that he'd somehow known I would face. On October 10, 2020, 14 years after our last conversation, I sat in my apartment in Rome, watching television coverage of Carlo Acutis' beatification ceremony in Assisi. Thousands of young people from around the world had gathered to witness the Catholic Church's official recognition of Carlo as Blessed Carlo Acutis, one step away from full sainthood. As Cardinal Angelo Becciu read the formal declaration of beatification, I found myself overwhelmed with emotions I'd been suppressing for 14 years. Here was public official acknowledgement that the extraordinary teenager I'd met in a small Milan bookstore was indeed what I'd gradually come to suspect. A saint whose supernatural gifts had extended beyond his death to continue his earthly mission of bringing others closer to divine truth. But what moved me most deeply wasn't the ceremony itself, magnificent as it was. It was seeing the faces of young people in the crowd, teenagers and young adults who had been inspired by Carlo's example to embrace both technology and faith, rationality and spirituality, modern life and ancient wisdom. Many held signs displaying quotes from Carlo's writings and interviews, but one quote in particular caught my attention and nearly brought me to tears. "To be always close to Jesus, this is my life plan." Hearing those words, I remembered our very first conversation about living according to purposes larger than personal ambition. Carlo had been trying to share his life plan with me long before I was ready to understand what he meant by closeness to the divine. During the televised ceremony, they showed footage of Carlo's website documenting Eucharistic miracles, the same digital exhibition he had shown me on his camera in October 2006. Seeing his work presented to a global audience, I realized that our conversations in the bookstore had been part of Carlo's larger mission to demonstrate that faith and technology could serve each other, that spiritual truth could be communicated through digital media, that modern tools could deepen rather than replace ancient wisdom. By engaging with a skeptical computer science student, Carlo had been modeling the kind of bridge building between secular and sacred worlds that would characterize his posthumous influence. After the ceremony, I received a call from Dr. Benedetti, who had become a friend during the years of investigation. "Alessandro," she said, "I wanted you to hear this from me before it becomes public. Your testimony was specifically cited in the official documentation supporting Carlo's beatification. The Congregation for the Causes of Saints identified your encounters with him as evidence of supernatural charism extending beyond his death." The news was both humbling and overwhelming. My private spiritual struggle had become part of the Church's public record of miraculous intervention in ordinary life. The conversations I'd tried to dismiss as coincidence or imagination were now officially recognized as supernatural encounters that demonstrated Carlo's saintly intercession for those needing spiritual guidance. "But there's more," Dr. Benedetti continued. "We've received dozens of new testimonies from people reporting encounters with Carlo since news of your experience became known. Young people facing crises of faith, families dealing with terminal illness, individuals struggling to integrate spiritual searching with modern life, all describing dreams, visions, or inexplicable moments of guidance that they attribute to Carlo's intercession. Your willingness to share your story has opened floodgates of testimony about Carlo's continuing ministry." The revelation was both wonderful and daunting. My decision to publicly acknowledge what I'd experienced had apparently encouraged others to recognize and report their own supernatural encounters with Carlo. The teenage saint who had spent his earthly life creating digital exhibitions of miracles was now generating his own miraculous testimonies from people around the world. That evening, alone in my apartment, I did something I'd been avoiding for 14 years. I spoke aloud to Carlo, addressing him directly as someone I believed was still present and active, though in ways I couldn't see or fully comprehend. "Carlo," I said, feeling somewhat foolish but also strangely comforted, "I finally understand what you were preparing me for. Not just Sophia's illness and death, not just my own spiritual growth, but this, serving as witness to your continuing ministry, helping others recognize that supernatural intervention is still happening in ordinary lives. I paused, listening to the silence of my apartment, then continued. I know you can't respond in ways I can hear or see, but I need you to know that everything you predicted came true. Everything you prepared me for, I faced. Everything you taught me, I needed. And now I'm ready to spend whatever years I have left helping others understand that spiritual reality is as real and important as anything technology can measure or create. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the same sense of peaceful presence I'd felt during our conversations 14 years earlier. That quality of being seen and understood, and accompanied by someone whose perspective transcended my limited human viewpoint. For the first time since our last meeting, I felt Carlo's continuing friendship as clearly as I had felt it during those transformative weeks in October 2006. In the months following the beatification, my life took on new purpose and direction. I began speaking more publicly about my experiences with Carlo, appearing at conferences and retreats where I shared testimony about supernatural intervention in ordinary life. Initially, I worried that my lack of formal theological training would limit my credibility with religious audiences. But I discovered that my background as a skeptical technologist actually enhanced the impact of my testimony. When someone with my secular credentials reported supernatural encounters, people listened differently than they might to testimony from conventional religious sources. I also started developing digital platforms specifically designed to collect and share testimonies of miraculous intervention in contemporary life. Working with the Vatican's Communications Office, I helped create websites and databases that documented modern encounters with saints, angels, and other forms of divine assistance. The project felt like perfect synthesis of Carlo's two great passions, using technology to document evidence of spiritual reality and encouraging others to remain open to supernatural possibilities in their own lives. You're continuing Carlo's work, Dr. Benedetti observed during one of our planning meetings, but more than that, you're doing it in exactly the way he prepared you to do it, bringing technological sophistication to spiritual documentation, bridging secular and religious audiences, helping people integrate faith and reason rather than choosing between them. The Digital Testimonies project exceeded all our expectations. Within 2 years, we had collected more than 1,000 reports of supernatural encounters from people around the world, healings that defied medical explanation, providential interventions in desperate circumstances, moments of divine guidance that arrived precisely when needed. Many of these testimonies specifically mentioned Carlo's intercession, describing dreams, visions, or inexplicable experiences of assistance that people attributed to the blessed teenager's continuing ministry. Reading these reports, I began to understand the scope of Carlo's posthumous impact. The boy who had used his brief earthly life to create one website documenting historical miracles had become the subject of countless testimonies about contemporary miracles, evidence that supernatural intervention in human affairs was continuing in our technological age. But perhaps the most meaningful development was more personal. I began to understand that my encounter with Carlo had been part of a larger pattern of preparation for specific vocation. Just as he had somehow known that I would need guidance for facing Sophia's illness, he had also known that my experience of love, loss, and spiritual growth would equip me to help others navigate similar challenges. My testimony about our conversations had become a doorway for others to recognize and report their own supernatural experiences. My work documenting modern miracles was serving Carlo's larger mission of demonstrating that divine intervention was continuing in contemporary life. In late 2022, 16 years after our conversations, I received a letter that brought everything full circle in ways I could never have anticipated. It was from Marco Santini, a young computer science student in Milan who had read my testimony about Carlo and felt compelled to share his own story. Signor Ferretti, he wrote, I am studying computer science at Bocconi University, just as you did. Like you, I have always been skeptical about religious claims and focused on purely rational explanations for everything. But 3 weeks ago, I experienced something that has challenged everything I thought I knew about reality. Marco went on to describe encounters strikingly similar to my own. A mysterious teenager appearing at his university, engaging him in profound conversations about technology, spirituality and purpose, demonstrating uncanny insight into his character and future plans. The description of the young man matched Carlo exactly. Dark hair, bright eyes, blue hoodie, extraordinary maturity, passionate enthusiasm for using technology to serve others. The strangest part, Marco's letter continued, is that according to friends who were with me during some of these conversations, I was talking to empty air. They couldn't see or hear anyone, but I experienced lengthy discussions with someone who knew details about my life that no stranger could possibly know, who challenged my assumptions about meaning and purpose with exactly the kind of questions I needed to hear. Marco concluded his letter with a question that brought tears to my eyes. Do you think it's possible that Blessed Carlo is still appearing to people who need guidance? Do you think I should trust what I experienced, even though it defies rational explanation? And if so, what should I do with this experience? I immediately called Marco and arranged to meet him in Milan. Sitting across from him in a cafe near Bocconi University, the same university where I had been studying 16 years earlier, I felt like I was looking at a younger version of myself. Someone at the beginning of the same journey of spiritual discovery that had transformed my life. His questions, his skepticism, his hunger for meaning beyond material success, all of it was achingly familiar. Let me tell you what I wish someone had told me when I was your age, and facing the same questions, I said, trust what you experienced, not because it's easy to explain, but because it's changing you in ways that serve purposes larger than your personal ambition. Carlo appears to people who need guidance for challenges they haven't faced yet, preparation for vocations they haven't imagined yet. Your encounter with him isn't ending, it's beginning. And what he's preparing you for will be exactly what you need to become who you're meant to be. As I spoke these words to Marco, I realized that my role in Carlo's continuing ministry had evolved again. I was no longer just witness to supernatural intervention in my own life. I had become guide for others experiencing similar interventions, someone who could help them understand that their impossible encounters were invitations to growth and service they couldn't yet comprehend. The circle was completing itself in ways that revealed the scope of divine providence. Carlo had prepared me for Sophia's illness and death. That experience had prepared me for documenting modern miracles and supporting others facing spiritual crises. And now I was being called to mentor the next generation of people whom Carlo was personally guiding toward purposes larger than they could imagine. Each person he touched became equipped to help others recognize and respond to supernatural intervention in their own lives. The teenage saint who had spent his earthly life creating digital exhibitions of historical miracles had become the center of an expanding network of contemporary testimonies about God's continuing presence in ordinary human experience. Today, as I write this testimony 18 years after our first conversation, Carlo Acutis has been officially declared blessed by the Catholic Church and is widely expected to achieve full sainthood within the next few years. His tomb in Assisi has become a pilgrimage destination for young people from around the world, and his example has inspired countless individuals to integrate technology, faith, and service in their own lives. But for me, Carlo will always be the 15-year-old boy who spent his final weeks on Earth walking into a small bookstore to challenge a cynical university student's assumptions about reality, meaning, and purpose. Our conversations changed the trajectory of my entire life, not through dramatic miracles or supernatural spectacles, but through patient, loving guidance that prepared me for challenges and opportunities I couldn't yet imagine. The most remarkable thing about Carlo's influence on my life is how natural it has felt. Despite the supernatural circumstances of our encounters, the transformation he initiated in my perspective and priorities unfolded organically. Growing from seeds he planted through simple questions and gentle challenges, he never tried to overwhelm me with religious doctrine or force dramatic conversion. Instead, he invited me to remain open to possibilities I had been too quick to dismiss, to consider that rational thinking and spiritual awareness could complement rather than contradict each other. to recognize that the most important realities might be those that couldn't be measured or controlled. This approach was perfectly suited to my temperament and needs, someone who required evidence and reasoning, but who also hungered for meaning beyond material success. Looking back on the intervening years, I can see how every major decision and experience of my adult life has been shaped by insights Carlo shared during those 3 transformative weeks. My choice of career serving others rather than maximizing personal profit, my willingness to explore spiritual questions despite my secular background, my readiness to follow Sophia to Rome and rebuild my life around love rather than security, my ability to face her illness and death with grace rather than despair, my current vocation, helping others document and understand supernatural intervention in contemporary life. All of it traces back to foundations Carlo established in my thinking and values. He gave me framework for living that could accommodate both rational analysis and spiritual openness, both technological sophistication and faith in realities beyond physical measurement. But perhaps most importantly, Carlo taught me that purpose and meaning emerge not from avoiding difficulty, but from responding to difficulty with love, faith, and service to others. Sophia's cancer, devastating as it was personally, became opportunity for both of us to discover spiritual resources we wouldn't have needed otherwise, to deepen our love beyond what easy circumstances could have achieved, to offer hope and guidance to others facing similar trials. Our suffering was transformed into service, exactly as Carlo had somehow known it would be. This transformation didn't eliminate the pain of loss, but it gave that pain meaning and purpose that made it bearable and even in strange way beautiful. Through my work documenting modern testimonies of miraculous intervention, I've met hundreds of people whose lives have been touched by supernatural guidance during moments of crisis or transition. Many of these encounters follow patterns similar to my experience with Carlo. Mysterious strangers appearing at crucial moments with exactly the insight or encouragement needed. Impossible knowledge of personal circumstances and future challenges. Guidance that proves precisely accurate over time. What strikes me about these testimonies is how carefully calibrated the divine assistance appears to be, never overwhelming or forcing belief, but always offering exactly what each individual needs to grow spiritually and serve others more effectively. I've come to understand that my encounter with Carlo was neither unique nor random. It was part of a larger pattern of divine providence working through human relationships to accomplish purposes beyond individual salvation or comfort. Carlo appears to people who can be transformed into instruments of his continuing mission. Individuals who, after experiencing supernatural guidance themselves, become equipped to help others recognize and respond to similar guidance in their own lives. The teenage saint who spent his earthly life creating digital networks to spread awareness of God's presence in the world has continued that mission posthumously through personal mentorship of specific individuals who can extend his reach into new communities and contexts. This understanding has given me profound peace about questions that troubled me for many years after our conversations. Why was I chosen for such extraordinary guidance? Not because I was particularly worthy or holy, but because my background and temperament made me suitable instrument for specific aspects of Carlo's continuing ministry. My skeptical, technological mindset allowed me to document supernatural experiences in ways that would be credible to secular audiences. My experience of love and loss equipped me to counsel others facing similar challenges. My ability to bridge rational and spiritual perspectives enabled me to help people integrate faith and reason rather than choosing between them. Carlo hadn't chosen me despite my limitations, but because of how those limitations could be transformed into strengths serving his larger mission. The young people who visit Carlo's tomb in Assisi often ask me about practical implications of his example for their own lives. What does it mean to follow Carlo's path in our technological age? How can they serve God's purposes through modern tools and opportunities? My answer is always the same. Pay attention to the people around you with the same intensity that Carlo paid attention to me. Look for opportunities to offer exactly the guidance, encouragement, or practical assistance that someone needs at exactly the moment they need it. Use whatever gifts and resources you have, technological skills, artistic talents, professional opportunities, life experiences, to help others discover that they are seen, loved, and called to purposes larger than personal ambition. This is how saints are made, not through dramatic miracles or mystical experiences, but through consistent, loving attention to God's presence in ordinary human encounters. Carlo's influence on my life has also taught me important lessons about the relationship between time and eternity. During our conversations, he somehow knew details about my future that wouldn't be revealed for years. From his perspective, already partially existing in eternity, my entire life was visible as single coherent narrative rather than series of uncertain chapters. This divine perspective allowed him to provide guidance perfectly calibrated to challenges I would face years later. Preparation for growth opportunities I couldn't yet imagine. Understanding this has given me profound trust in divine providence, confidence that whatever difficulties I encounter are also opportunities for growth that serves purposes beyond my immediate comprehension. As I've grown older, I've also come to appreciate the gift of having experienced unquestionable supernatural intervention early enough in life to shape all my subsequent decisions and relationships. Many people struggle with doubt about spiritual reality, uncertain whether their faith is wishful thinking or authentic recognition of divine truth. I have been spared that uncertainty. I know, based on direct experience, that supernatural reality exists, that divine providence shapes human affairs, that love transcends death, that suffering can serve redemptive purposes. This knowledge hasn't eliminated all struggle from my spiritual journey, but it has provided foundation of certainty that supports me through periods of doubt, confusion, or grief. My testimony today reaches you through digital platforms that Carlo pioneered, using internet technology to document and share evidence of God's continuing presence in the world. The irony is not lost on me that a teenager who died before social media became ubiquitous has become one of the most influential digital evangelists in history. His example has inspired countless young people to use technology for purposes larger than entertainment or commercial gain, to create online communities focused on spiritual growth and social service, to demonstrate that faith and technological sophistication can complement rather than conflict with each other. In this sense, Carlo's vision of digital evangelization has been fulfilled beyond anything he could have imagined during his brief earthly life. But the deepest lesson Carlo taught me is simpler and more universal than any specific approach to technology or ministry. That every human encounter is potentially sacred, every conversation is opportunity to serve divine purposes, every relationship can become instrument of supernatural grace. The 3 weeks I spent talking with him in a small Milan bookstore were outwardly unremarkable, just a customer and employee having philosophical discussions. But those conversations became foundation for everything meaningful in my adult life, because Carlo approached them with complete attention, genuine love, and absolute trust that God was working through our interactions to accomplish purposes beyond our understanding. This is the invitation Carlo extends to every person who encounters his story, to approach your O